Hi, everyone. Welcome to Org Vitality's virtual conference. Thank you for attending this session, Creating Impactful and Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion Programs. We're going to get started in just a minute or so. Thank you for your patience. Hi, everyone. Welcome to the webinar. I see quite a few people joining. We'll wait for everyone to finish signing in and get started in just a minute or so here. Appreciate everyone's patience. All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the conference. My name is Victoria Hendrickson, and I'm with Org Vitality. And I'm going to get things set up before I hand things off to our speaker, Amri Johnson. We hope you're all enjoying the conference so far. This is the second session in a two-day virtual conference. So if you haven't gotten a chance to check out any of the other sessions, please do so at orgvitality.com. There's still plenty of time to sign up for the other sessions coming up today and tomorrow. But I want to talk a little bit about this session. This is one I'm really excited about. It's a very important topic, and it's really timely for what a lot of our organizations are talking about today. It's titled Creating Impactful and Sustainable Diversity and Inclusion Programs. Today, Amri's talk will go beyond why D&I programs are important and really get into the tough work of how you make them stick and how you make it a meaningful part of your culture rather than just another initiative. You'll all receive a copy of the slides, so no need to take super detailed notes. I'd encourage you all to sit back and enjoy the presentation. A couple of housekeeping points. You're all on mute, so please do write in any questions you have into the Q&A box or the chat box at the bottom of Zoom. I'm going to monitor those throughout the hour, and we will have plenty of time for Q&A at the end. So I really do encourage you to all think about the content here and the context of your organization and ask those important questions while we have Amri with us today. So with those details out of the way, I'd like to introduce you to Amri Johnson. Amri is an affiliate of OV, and he's the CEO of Inclusion Wins. For over 20 years, Amri Johnson has been instrumental in helping organizations and their people create extraordinary business outcomes. He's a social capitalist, epidemiologist, entrepreneur, executive coach, and inclusion strategist. His dialogic approach to engaging all people as leaders and change agents has fostered the opening of minds and deepening of skill sets with organizational leaders and citizens, enabling them to thrive and contribute to each other and their respective organizations. Most recently, he was the head of global cultural intelligence and inclusion at Novartis, and he's brought all of that work into his consulting firm, Inclusion Wins. He's currently writing a manuscript for change makers with the intention of systemically embedding inclusion in a manner that's not just accessible for all, but actionable in a daily business practice and sustainable over time. Amri is originally from Topeka, Kansas. He's lived and worked throughout the US, Brazil, and he's currently in Basel, Switzerland with his wife, Martina, and his 3 kids. So clearly, Amri has deep expertise in this area, a lot of experience to share. We're very proud to have him with us today. So I'm gonna stop talking now and hand it over to Amri. Amri, take it away.
Thank you, Victoria. And I just want to, first of all, just thank Org Vitality for such a really well thought out conference. There's been so many virtual experiences and conferences that I've seen this year, but the practicality that I see with the Org Vitality conference is really encouraging. And I hope as many of you as possible can attend as many sessions as you possibly can. I also want to thank Jeff, who presented earlier. Jeff's been great as a partner, and Sertrice Grice, who's been working with me as I become an affiliate of OV, and Amanda for guiding me through today. All have been great collaborators, and I'm really excited about the future. So today, I want to talk to you about this notion of creating impactful programs, but not just impactful, because that can really be short-lived. You can do something, you can have a big splash, everybody can get excited or everybody can be entertained, but how you make that consistently actionable and give people agency to continue to build capacity. is really what I think is where the rubber meets the road. And so we're going to talk about this notion of sustainability, but also accessibility and action so that everybody in the organization benefits from your inclusion work. If I can, okay. So a little overview of today. I'm going to talk a little bit about what matters and why. I'm going to use the context of my previous organization, which is Novartis Institutes for Biomedical Research, the research division of Novartis. I worked throughout the 100,000 plus entity of Novartis, but my main work and where I started was in the research division. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what mattered to them and why, and I'd like you to kind of think about it with your own context. Then I'll talk about how D&I enables using some examples from my work at what we called NIBR, both from how this worked at the executive level and then all the way through the grassroots, and how a philosophy emerged from that work. Talk a little bit about where we are right now, because the world's shifted. I don't need to say that to you all on these calls, running businesses. It's a lot going on, and it's important for us to bring attention to that. I'll do a little overview about my firm, Inclusion Wins, and then I'll open it up to see where we go from here. So the inception of our inclusion and diversity and equity journey at the Novartis Institutes for Biomedical Research was really focused on this research strategy, and it was really inspirational and clear. In actuality, I had been working as a consultant for 10 years, and when they called me, I was like, I don't know if I want to come and work for a big company like Novartis. I was impressed and I was flattered, but I was like, I don't know. Am I going to have any agency? Am I going to be able to do this right? But when I heard from the CEO about this research strategy that everybody had access to, it was about patient need, and it was about having the broadest understanding of the science behind it. And those were always the targets. And so it was great. What was great about this is that it was clear to everyone in the organization. They knew it, and most knew that their role had something to do with it. The projects that they worked on were all aiming for this. They didn't necessarily know or have to know the entire pipeline, but they could access people who worked on adjacent science, and when it made sense scientifically, they could ask scientific questions together, pursue new possibilities that they could share with their leadership. Was it perfect? No, nothing is. Did people feel like they had agency? I'd say largely they did. And part of our work in the inclusion and culture space was working towards more people consistently feeling like their work was meaningful, and that through their ideas, they had agency. Agency refers to the thoughts and actions taken by people that express their individual power. So we wanted the dynamics of how ideas get listened to not be about power and hierarchy. We wanted them to be about belonging and feeling like you can contribute at your highest level. And so that was the kind of the notion of our work, and that's what we sought after. So again, we wanted agency not to be about elevating this individual power or control of others, but in self-management, expression, and contribution. So this desired culture, and the former president, Mark Fishman, who I have tremendous respect for, he's one of the greatest scientists in the world, he called this a sociology of innovation. And we surmised that it would take certain behaviors that were productive in helping to make that a reality. So just to be clear, these are scientists. And if some of you on the call are scientists are pretty hardcore. I'm an epidemiologist. I remember going in front of people in grand rounds and doing presentations, and it was, quite frankly, sometimes it was brutal. But I never felt like there wasn't a respect, and I never felt like we were related. And after we did our talk, with all the challenge, we could have this collegiality and openness and learning that was continuous. And that's what we were working to build, not D and nice, but D and I, really inclusion that helped everybody grow and contribute at their highest level. Now, one of the definitions that I have was that this notion of openness, it falls under this broad concept of inclusion. Jeff mentioned the notion of openness a little bit before, and there's some research around that. And one way I look at inclusion is that people have a willingness to be influenced by the so-called other. What we found is that there is often willingness in organizations, but less often people have the skills to be open and to go from a theoretical openness, which would be to some based on their power and often position in the social hierarchy. They're open, you know, because they can be, or they feel like they can be open, and they might have openness to one group of people or one person versus another. We weren't talking about that. We're talking about a true willingness to be influenced with little to no consideration of positional power. Great ideas emanate from everywhere. The question is, how often do we capture such ideas when they don't come from a particular phenotype or archetype that we've come to expect them from? Now, part of this is also that we needed to have the structures within teams, projects, platforms, within leadership teams and decision boards that are all the foundation for the mental models and mindsets that create room for, you know, how we can create this desired culture. And there's no prescription for this, and it won't be the same for everyone. So while we entered in like this, and this was the approach that we took, we believe that there's facets of this that any organization can take, but it's not the same for all. So one could argue that there are certain attributes that could be common, things about clarity around cognitive bias, making sure that feedback is given to everyone, development of people is not optional, and that even though we're already good, we can always get better. So those mindsets were important. And we started here because not everybody was convinced that this whole D&I thing was worth the investment. They were concerned about science. They also, even though they were concerned about science, they did to relate to the idea, relate to ideas of diverse disciplines and working effectively with one another. They knew that the drug discovery is across a disciplinary effort. So they were satisfied with ideas like biodiversity, and we were able to bring notions like that to the fore. And I'll share a little bit about what we did to get there. What really was awesome is a lot of our work turned out to be kind of ongoing feedback and coaching with the leaders, really bringing to attention to themselves and their teams how this was impacting the science and how inclusion was a construct or a relational construct that they could use to do better science. And that really resonated with them. So I'm going to share a little bit about how we did that. So we became flies on the wall. We heard lots of things. And what we did initially is we really got clear about how we were going to approach this. And we knew we needed to address the top leaders and the places where the most important decisions were made. And so we decided to become flies on the wall, and we created a so-called human technology to observe decision board meetings. So these were meetings where all the critical decisions were happening and where the middle managers often were presenting to a multidisciplinary group of experts who were the senior decision makers. And indeed, what we heard was quite fascinating. So this was the kind of human technology that we used. And we trained a team of people, mostly from my office in D&I and with my then supervisor, who was a molecular geneticist who came into this work out of a role in communications, but she was just amazing in the way that we thought about this through together. So the most important thing to us that we wanted to measure was advocacy, which were people stating an opinion, sharing data and facts, as well as inquiry and asking questions, really meaningful questions that move the conversation forward towards decisions. And we were really clear that we were observing some of the kind of subversive questions, or questions that really weren't a question, like a statement masking a criticism and ending with an inflection of voice to sound like a question. We were clear, and we told the leaders that's advocacy. And when we spoke to the groups and the leader of the group, we made it clear, and we made sure that they understood the impact of that way of being. So we gave them basically a mirror with data to see how they were behaving. So inclusion is a behavioral construct, a relational behavioral construct. And oftentimes, you have to have the behaviors, and then you have to look at the structure. So we started with the leaders around behavior, and then we began to talk to them about how we create different structures of the meeting so that we get the most out of the presentations. We can gather the most data and make our decisions with the least amount of bias. So we looked at advocacy and inquiry, but we also looked at how people acknowledged each other, It was a pretty long list. We looked at some of what we would call non-conducive behaviors, like people checking their Blackberries. There were Blackberries back then. I don't know if they still exist. Anybody from Canada, I hope I don't offend. But we had Blackberries back then, or other mobile phones, people interrupting people, talking over one another, asking leading questions, and being sarcastic. The sarcasm one was a little bit challenging at times because some of these executive scientists were curmudgeon-y professors who were fueled by sarcasm. We had to tell them about the impact of that, how to utilize it to be around humor, which was a conducive behavior rather than something that detracted people from being able to share what they needed to share scientifically, things that were positive about the data, as well as things that weren't looking as good as they would like them to. The greatest outcome about the work we did with these groups was how we were able to coach some of these executives about the impact of their behavior. We didn't go in saying you were wrong or right. We came to them, we asked them how the meeting went, we shared data with them, then ask again, encourage them to take the perspective of other members and the more junior presenters. Even for those initially resistant to the idea of D&I, they could see the impact of their behaviors on what mattered to them. And over time, we began to have them actually self-monitor. And of course, observer bias was in effect. And when we were there, we did influence the group. They behaved differently. Our goal was to get them to behave in a manner that brought forth the best decisions. We had modest impact. One story, I was in a meeting in the UK, and the leader of that group was, I snuck in the back of the room, so I wasn't actually monitoring the group that day. I was just listening to the scientific discussions. And the leader of the group was just really not having his best day. His arms were flailing. Everybody was like, he was in a mood, I'll say. And everybody kept looking past him to me. And I was like, you guys don't look at me, don't look at me. It was kind of embarrassing. And then he turned around and he said, oh, snap. And the team laughed, but it broke the tension, and it allowed him to go back and reflect to say, yeah, I know I wasn't behaving in the way that I behave when they're here, and I need to get better. And we talked about it, and we got a good laugh, and he also learned quite a bit about it, because it's easy to go off the rails when emotion is involved and when you're passionate about something. He found the correction to go back and say, hey, team, I wasn't on point. I'm sorry. Let's continue to build capacity. So overlapping with those observations, we began to take the teams through different types of unconscious bias education. Now, some of you probably heard that unconscious bias training doesn't work, full stop. And in a way, that's true. And some of the data that's come back around that, it can actually create more bias. That's true. But we didn't go at this as training. We went through it as education. So it wasn't a one-time training. It was a series of workshops and experiential exercises to bring bias to their awareness, and then begin to get people across the organization, starting with the teams of the executives and their teams, to recognize the functioning of their so-called system 1 and 2 thinking, their fast and slow mechanisms in their subconscious mind and conscious minds responding to stimuli. So the education was related to talent decisions, strategic decisions, and team functioning, and it was ongoing. So we had an initial training. We had follow-up to that. That was sometimes reading or discussions. We had other full half-day education. We had shorter 1.5 to 2 hour, 90-minute, and sometimes virtual education. We built trainings around virtual meetings and how bias showed up in team meetings, and particularly when there was a virtual component. This was before we got to 2020 and the kind of broad experimentation that we've been doing now with video meetings. We were on that for a long time, and I think it really helped the organization, for those that had gone through it, to adjust to the shift. So we brought concepts to people's attention, but we also wanted people to start building skills to mitigate the adverse impacts of bias. Bias is going to always be there, and in a way, it's not 100% bad. There's certain biases that actually are beneficial to us. I won't go into that right now, but there are some. It's really what makes us expert. Our biases bring expertise to the table. But we also knew that there was more to it. And this this slide and the one before is from the Royal Society in the UK. It's worth Googling. They're really good videos if you haven't seen it before. It's well done. And for those who are in the process of their ongoing learning around unconscious bias, it's a good piece to use. Some of the things that we did that kind of brought some levity to it is we used the implicit association test. And a lot of people have used the Harvard implicit association test to do some of their unconscious bias training. And I'm going to take you through something. I know I can't hear you or see you right now, but I'd like you to read these words as fast as you can. I'll give you just a few seconds to do that. So read these words out loud wherever you might be. If you're in an office when there's people around, just do it softly, but read really fast: red, blue, orange, purple, blah, blah, blah. Okay. You all are fast readers. We go to the next one. This time I want you to read the font colors of the words as fast as you can. Go. Okay, now that's a little more difficult, and the reason why it's more difficult is because there's a little dissonance there between what we see and what tasks we're asked to do, and dissonance happens to us all the time. And so we use this to talk to people about how dissonance can occur. This is a really benign example. There's much more dynamics of dissonance that are a little more less benign, I should say. But it's important to do this because it teaches people about slowing down, even if it's just slightly, when we're dealing with situations that on the surface look familiar to you, but as complexity increases, we have to slow down more and more. And so we use this as one example to build skills about what does slowing down look like. We also taught about things such as counter stereotypes. If anybody knows who this is, raise your hand. Just kidding. So some of you probably know this is Mahatma Gandhi. Gandhi was a lawyer. Don't hold it against him. He changed the world. And that's my only lawyer joke of the day. This is what's called a counter stereotype. We taught people about these, and we gave the organization other opportunities to form their own, which I'll mention in a little bit. We also gave people kind of ideas about how this might have transferred as a learning. So we wanted people to move towards enlightenment about their unconscious mind. And this notion of Ba comes from the tacit knowledge transfer literature of Professor Gerrit von Groh that's here in Zurich at the ETH, at the ETH Technical University here in Switzerland. And he, along with his Japanese co-authors, used this word Ba. It's this creating of space or an enabling context to explore information or ideas. And I like the notion of creating space as a way to think about accommodating perspectives, identities, and the various distinctions and intersections that exist in organizations. We have to create space for them, and this context allows for many possibilities. So we built this in. We gave people some insights on giving reflection and mindfulness, not suppressing. You have to be responsible for everything, consciously and unconsciously, but you don't have to feel guilty. This isn't about fault finding. This is about responsibility taking. We want to constantly have feedback. Some of that comes in the form of data, and that will vary from organization to organization. And then, of course, exploring the various angles, the individual and organizational impact, whether it's working for you or not, and really making that habitual. And if you do all that, is in addition to positive exposure and counter stereotypes, you can become enlightened where unconscious bias is concerned. And that was our goal, is to give people enough depth that they can apply these concepts to their everyday. So I'm going to talk a little bit about where we went from here. A lot of this was top down. Eventually it hit the middle managers, and we did a lot of the bias training. Eventually we opened it up, and everybody had access to all of the education in the organization, from all hiring managers that we started with all the way through everybody at every level. But simultaneously, while we worked with top leaders, we also engaged the greater organization around this way of being, and a philosophy emerged out of that, and much of which is in alignment with my current firm, Inclusion Wins, and I'll share more about that. But now I'm just going to share a little bit about how we got there. So we didn't start our work with just executives. We also engaged the organization at large. We wanted to tap into our organizational networks, and we wanted to do our best at moving the organization towards an organic and self-organizing principle around culture development. This came in large part from our employee resource groups, which expanded in my division out of business challenges faced by people at various levels. For example, the cross-cultural employee resource group, they came together because there was a group of scientists that came from Japan that were amazing scientists when they were in Japan, and they didn't have voice or agency when they came to the extent that they had in Japan when they came to the US. And it caused a lot of them some challenges. These were the top scientists in the country coming to our labs and running teams in the US, and they weren't given the same agency. And it left people with certain biases around it. Some of them were around language, some of it was around cultural values and behaviors, and we were just not able to adjust. People weren't able to adjust their frequencies to get on the same page with each other. And so the cross-cultural employee resource group was born to teach around cultural intelligence for the members of that group to be certified in cultural intelligence. They built a Toastmasters club for people to get more comfortable with speaking. And that club is still one of the biggest in the Cambridge area and has won a lot of awards. And subsequently, 2 large clubs were built in Basel that have served the entirety of Novartis, not in Cambridge and Basel, not just in the research division. So these groups, again, another one was our Cambridge in vivo community, and this group was responsible for working with animals and animal models. And the goal was always, as we know of those of us that have been in pharmaceuticals, in biotech, is we want the most humane and compassionate use of animals. This group did this through education, and eventually they moved into policymaking. Our women's group, which was called the Cambridge Women's Resource Group, they were working with a considerable number of men that were part of the group. They worked on robust mentoring programs with the intention of people development for everybody. So the programs were not just for women, they were for all. And many of the people that engaged ended up in very senior roles, the women did. And unfortunately, because of the development and mentorship, some of them left the organization. They gained more agency. I wasn't disappointed that they went and found something more. Obviously, I would have loved to have them in the organization. I never saw them going to a higher level role as bad. Do I wish we would have retained as many as possible? Yes, and I think we did retain quite a few, but overall the group fulfilled its purpose with the programming that they did, and they weren't about a single identity, they were for everyone. At the time I was there, I intentionally steered people away from single identity groups. So we had a women's group with many men, as I shared. We had the cross-cultural group. We had one for a non-managerial junior managers development and networking needs. We had an admin group. We had a global informatics community that, as pharmaceuticals went so-called digital, they've played a key role in the strategy for the organization to this day. But my intention was not encouraging single identity groups, was not that representation is or was unimportant, but it was a result of me wanting to steer people towards creating connections that were not solely identity based. What I found is these naturally happen in most organizations if there's potential for exposure. I was more focused on creating connections that would be less likely if mixed groups did not exist. Yes, representation matters. It always has, it always will. Still, I wanted to, via greater connectivity, give people a lens and tools whereby they could learn to zoom in and out more reflexively to how they viewed and engaged with individuals and groups. And to do that, they needed to interact with more people, more diverse swaths of people, more diverse swaths of folks. So I worked with the ERGs, getting them to collaborate, all with the idea of fulfilling on the business strategy, and all they did, maximizing the human and financial resources available to them, with the human resources far outweighing the financial. So a big intersection of their work together, as I shared, was around mentoring. And this was some of the data that we looked at around mentoring. We provided a foundational education for all mentors and mentees. So it wasn't like just go out and perpetuate myths of mentorship or go and connect with people that are like you, which happens a lot of time in mentoring programs. We really gave them a deep education around mentoring and the mentoring functions, including this notion of sponsorship, which originally was a part of the mentoring functions. There's been a lot of writers that talked about mentor and sponsorship separately. We didn't separate the two. We separated the behaviors that went along with those. So these groups have been sustainable, and many of their efforts that we started expanded globally and are still going on today for about 9, almost 10 years. And that's according to my inside source, who is my wife, who still works there. So some of the internal work around network and analysis we did that network analysis with a few of the cohorts, mentors and mentees from our ERG mentoring programs, and this is some of that data. It just shows some of the connections and how those connections both stayed in the organization, and then some that left, and we had to look at retention, and we were able to go back and talk to the people organization more and more about that. So the philosophy that emerged around this was in 3 areas. We wanted to look at intersections of difference and building skills, as well as networks for sustainability in terms of making those connections across difference. So the first kind of component, what I originally called intersectionality, but I stopped calling it intersectionality because the notion of intersectionality has been so politically charged. We wanted people to understand that this whole notion of intersectionality and multidimensionality was that individuals are multitudes of differences and talents and mindsets that lead to a diversity of problem-solving approaches and thinking and our possibilities and potentials to innovate. The next one was around bridging over bonding. Any of you that are familiar with Robert Putnam's work, he talks about bridging and bonding social capital. So bridging means we intentionally associate ourselves with many people and their perspectives, exposing us to dimensions of understanding impossible to replicate without such encounters. As in contrast to bonding, which happens a lot, is we go and move towards sameness, what they call homophily. So we tend to connect with those similar to ourselves. Lastly, was inclusive networks, is we wanted to create mechanisms for people to consistently connect in diverse groups that resulted in ideas that foster a collaborative and innovative environment. So that philosophy was brewing as we were doing our work. So it wasn't something that I came in with, it's something that emerged. And then we began to think about our sustainability strategy around that philosophy. So dimensionality, I think intersectionality is easier for me, but multidimensionality, just using this example, a bioengineer and a biologist are going to look at a similar problem differently, and they're going to bring those perspectives together. How can they look at their knowledge and expertise, where they come from, and how they can kind of mesh those two things to come up with the best solutions for the organization. We know that diversity is reflective of complexity, and if you overlay the various distinctions of the individual with that of the various human kinds and groups that they're a part of, then overlay that with organizational complexity, and then their various socio and social psychological profiles, the permutations are endless. They all hold a variety of potentials for contribution, and the need is that organizations have to create the space from such complexity. And when I talk about space, a model that I've been using for a while is I talk about diversity as potential energy and inclusion as kinetic. One of my definitions, again, another definition for inclusion and diversity comes from the late Dr. Roosevelt Thomas, who's one of my role models and heroes. He went to my college, Morehouse College, and he used to say that diversity is any mixture of similarities and difference and their respective tensions and complexities. So he reflects that notion of complexness, but I've also thought about this notion of diversity as potential energy or creating of space, and the space can expand or it contract, and it has those characteristics. And this list that I gave here around openness, perspectives, unlimited potential possibility, and growth or growth mindset is discrete, but one can add many other characteristics along these lines. On the flip side, for inclusion, inclusion is kinetic, it's actionable. You have to be doing things. It's creating these connections or the glue. So the space is what we use to create capacity for all the distinctions. The glue is how we connect them, regardless of the spatial relationship that we might have. They might be connected a little far out, they might be connected a little closer in, but the whole idea is that we could create these connections, we can create community, we can collaborate better, we can make impact together, and we can grow our mastery of what we're trying to create as a whole. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this, but this is the notion of 2D diversity from the Center for Talent Innovation. It's just another piece of data that you can use if you're so inclined, and their papers are really good to understand how 2D diversity, or diversity that's inherent and acquired, impacts the way you do business. And they did really some great research that talked about people being able to get heard, feeling safe, and that psychological safety to contribute novel ideas. People give actionable feedback. There's shared credit. It's not colonized credit. It's not one person gets credit or gets as much as they can. Everybody wins. As I say, when inclusion wins, everyone wins. And again, another piece of data to further your equity, diversity, and inclusion efforts. It leads to better decision-making, performance, innovation, financial results, and on top of what I mentioned from the last slide around leadership. So the multidimensional lens recognizes that individual, group, and organizational contexts have many configurations and settings. If you were a music producer working across various genres, let's say you're somebody like the guy that did Happy, what's his name, Pharrell. So Pharrell, he works across various genres. You have to know the artist, the audience, the musical combinations, and have to address the various dimensions of sound for uniqueness and resonance with all of the above. That takes a multidimensional lens, able to skillfully, in a situational way, adjust. And this is the same way for practicing inclusion. It's this multidimensional lens that's able to make adjustments, and that's an ongoing life learning process. So I've talked about multidimensionality. I'll talk briefly about bridging and bonding, and this is where I think about this notion of zooming in and out. Organizations and individuals often can zoom in or out. They have a tendency towards one or the other. For example, it might be detail orientation, so they zoom in, or it's big picture, zoom out. Some people, that's the frame of the world that they look at. Inclusion requires zooming in and out. So this is from one of my favorite books and subsequently movies. This was from The Fellowship of the Ring, and this is where Frodo sees the wraiths coming. They're like these ghost creatures that you can't see, but Frodo had this sense that they were coming, and he told people to get off of the path so that they couldn't see them. So this is the example of a dolly zoom. So this is a close-up zoom and a dolly zoom. And so what this does is it changes the spatial relationship with the scenery. Just like when you can zoom in and out or dolly zoom in and out, you can see the detail and you can change your spatial relationship with those you might not have previously had connected with. So it allows you to zoom in and zoom out, and that's extremely important. And it's not something that most of the time we think about, but it is a skill set, and it takes both kind of some really specific skills, and it takes a level of exposure. So what we did as one other program that was highly successful is we worked with post-baccalaureate and summer programs over multiple years, and we've prepared over, and I say we is when I was there, and they continue to have some of these programs, over 100 scholars for under resource groups, and they entered top schools, MD, PhD programs, both in the biomedical sciences and some in public health. We changed the spatial relationship with these scholars and summer interns, not just for the interns, but also for the mentors. So these students were very smart from under-resourced, or you might say underrepresented contexts. They had high aptitude, but they were significantly less exposed than the more privileged scholars whose family and circles that they lived in were often heavily experienced in high-level science. we created a bridge for them, and they were a bridge for our scientists to become more exposed to students from backgrounds that most of them, more than likely, would have never encountered. The connections were life-changing for both the scientists and for the scholars who have gone to the schools listed, and much, much more. Another slide just for data purposes. A lot of times people are very technical, but as you become higher level in your journey, you really need to build greater self and social awareness. And this was another kind of premise of why we move forward with this philosophy. So lastly is this notion of inclusive networks and these diverse groups. Some of you are familiar with the work of Mark Granovetter and the strength of weak ties. We need to create these networks with intention. And so any of you that ever watched a TED Talk by Margaret Heffernan, she talks about this. She talks about the real influencers of the organizations, these network nodes, and talking about investing in connections and team members. It reduces risk. It allows us to see where the experts are. And this is an example in Twitter. I've been a little bit Twitter averse lately because it's been a little difficult to stay on there, like personally. But the research around Twitter networks, as you can see, the network on the left is a lot more diverse. The other one is a little more redundant. A lot of the people, a lot of the nodes in there are familiar or connected with one another. The other one on the left is a lot more diverse and a lot more gives a lot more opportunities for bridging. Lastly, this is the premise of innovation. I came across this book when I was in graduate school. I refreshed it again while I was at Novartis. Jared Diamond is a polymath that's I think he's at UCLA. And he talks about the importance of technology, creating more technology, and the importance of an invention's diffusion potentially exceeds the importance of the original invention. So these networks are important, not just because it's great for people to connect. They're important because that's where the ideas flow from. And that's how we have great ideas actually come to the fore, because they eventually get into the organizational mind. It's like you put an idea out into this ether, and then it kind of moves around, touches different folks. And before you know it, the idea comes back enlightened, and more people learn as a result of the diffusion of that idea quickly through your networks. So I'm going to show a couple slides in a second. This next one's okay because it's just a few pictures about me, but I'm going to show some slides that might be a little disturbing. So if you're triggered by some of the things that have been happening around racial justice, I just say you might want to look away for a minute or so. I'm not going to take much time. So this is a little bit about me. At the center of my life is my spiritual journey. I actually didn't work a corporate job until 2009, and a lot of my 20s and 30s was really focused on my spiritual life and the centering of that, and it actually had driven the majority of my decisions and my kind of orientation to the world. I grew up in Topeka, Kansas. That top left corner is not Topeka, Kansas, but it is Kansas City, Kansas, where my mother grew up, and we had a roughly 20, 30 acre farm that my family farmed. My grandfather worked in a factory as a foreman. My parents, my father grew up in Topeka, Kansas, and was part of the Brown versus the Board of Education integration of schools. So the lens that my father had around racial justice was very much colored by the dynamics that he experienced integrating schools in Topeka. I went to Morehouse College, where Martin Luther King was a student, as well as Spike Lee and Samuel L. Jackson and Denzel Washington's son, many others that have gone to school there. I don't know why I just named actors and producers. There's a lot of other amazing people that have come out of there, but those are the ones that are probably names that you know well. That kind of drove me with great mentors, including Bill Jenkins, who was a Morehouse graduate or was a mentor, and he passed a couple years ago, to drive me into epidemiology. I didn't even know what that was, but I understood I wanted to look at populations, and he moved me there. That had me look at social determinants. That moved me into Cook Ross after a while, after starting a couple companies of my own in the space. And then below was my niece that also kind of gave me a different perspective by coming to live with me at age 14 as a single man. That's my wife before we had the little one next to us, and that's that picture at the bottom. And then that's my my 3 kids, my 2 stepkids that are 12, and my son, Romy and Raphael, and my son Kai. So I use all that as a background to say I'm intersectional and I know where my intersections lie. But I also know that I just want to talk a little bit about the fact that I feel like we did good work when I was at Novartis. I feel like there's still a lot of work to do. The US and the world needs to be clear about history. We also have to be clear that the protests for racial justice and anti-racist efforts are not for Black people, full stop. They are for everyone. The systems that hold back anyone from contributing at their highest levels and potential are an existential threat to businesses and society. We cannot think about this as something for them, whoever them are. These dynamics impact all of us. They always have, and they always will, and all of us need to address them. They're not new. They've been going on for a long time. Mamie Till Bradley worked with Black media outlets in her grief to show images of the inhumanity of her son's lynching in 1955 at age 14. Emmett Till's open casket was a critical moment for the country's awareness. In fact, and I'll say this in a little bit, is John Lewis talked about George Floyd and that Emmett Till was his George Floyd. Now, a lot of people don't necessarily accept this, and Frantz Fanon talked about this. When people have a strong belief, even when they're given evidence to the contrary, they go about trying to refute the evidence. It's called cognitive dissonance. And because it's so important for people to protect those beliefs, so sometimes rationalize it and deny it because it doesn't fit in. I'm not saying that that's not going to happen, but I'm saying as change agents in organizations, we have to be very clear that doing this now, these windows of opportunity have come over time and we've made a little progress. We cannot go back. We must go forward at this point. So our call to action is how can we mitigate the damage that persists and create equity in our organizations by critically looking at what created them. And that's in a systemic way. This was from 1917. I'm going back in history to show these things are not new. There was lynching going on 50 years after the Emancipation Proclamation. Black people were being killed. Their communities were being destroyed. My family lived in Oklahoma. Any of you that watched that HBO special, now I'm blanking on the name of it. It'll come back to me. Watchmen. I guess I'm a Marvel fan. I should have known that. Watchmen. Tulsa was horrible. And my family lived outside of Tulsa and dealt with basically being at war with men that came back from the war and were really jealous of what the Black community had created. So they just decided to bomb it. That happened in 1919, a couple years after these protests were happening with these men and women in New York City. This was a silent protest, 10,000 women, men, and children in New York City. Emmett Till's lynching was a catalyst for the civil rights movement in the country and influenced fights for justice across the globe. Where we are today, and I was very touched by what happened with the Black Lives Matter movement. I had obviously been in the US. I'm a Black man. I watched this over and over again. I never went to a march or a protest because I felt like I needed to do my work from the behind the scenes. And, when my family wanted to go to the Black Lives Matter march, I was like, whoa, I don't want to do that. It's a pandemic. I'm an epidemiologist. I should be more responsible. But I had to go, and I was very touched, and I'm still touched even when I see this picture because my family wanted to go. We have a brown boy in our home. We have me, but they understood that this is not about just me, not just about Kai. It's about everybody. We have a lot of work to do, and the youth and organization like yours, I know, are working to figure that out on your part. So I'm going to close out just to talk a little bit about my new firm, Inclusion Wins. Our brand, Inclusion Wins, is committed to impacting organizational systems with inclusion. We know that diversity as a space exists. I talked about that. But how do you design systems to mitigate bias, build skills, and constantly monitor progress? We have what we call our Systemic Inclusion Survey, powered by OrgView. Or org vitality rather. And this is how we like to start working with clients to enhance inclusion in their organizational systems and structures. We also work in cultural intelligence, which we believe is critical to helping people effectively zoom in and out. And lastly, social capital, including looking at the robustness and embeddedness of organizational networks with organizational network analysis. Excuse me. In addition, for us, that's also about the external networks we're impacting to enhance the ecosystems in which our clients do business and serve society at large. In closing, Bob Dylan wrote about the death of Emmett Till in a song a few years after Emmett Till's death and subsequent broadcasting of his mutilated body. But this is a song just to remind you and your fellow man, if we give all we could give, we could make this great land of ours a greater place to live. Let's think about that regardless of where we live, whether it's in the US or elsewhere in the world. Just give all we can give and we can make this place, this planet, a greater place to live for all. And I hope we all consistently choose humanity. And I will stop there. And Victoria, if there's any questions, I'm happy to entertain them.
Thank you, Amri. This has been very powerful. I really appreciate you sharing this with the group today. We do have a couple of questions coming in. So as I dive into them, I do just want to highlight that we've got about 10 minutes left. So if you haven't already typed in your question, please do so. I'm watching both the chat box as well as the Q&A session on Zoom. So please take a moment to enter any additional questions you have. But to get us started, Amri, I've got a question here that might relate to where a lot of organizations are, that they've been thinking about D&I, but maybe it hasn't been impactful. So the question is, what about a company that has already established their D&I efforts? How might they approach creating greater accessibility, action, and sustainability?
I think it starts with knowing where you are and what you're trying to create as an organization at large. So it's no cookie cutter, but the first thing to do is get a sense of what the organizational purpose is and does everybody understand that? And so once you get clear about that purpose, you get clear about your organizational reason for being and make sure that everybody understands that. I think that's step one. From there, you start looking at things programmatically and strategically that you can start putting into place. But along the way, one of the most critical things is that you have to engage the people, because the people will guide you. One of my colleagues, Sharon Collins, she's a big fan of appreciative inquiry, as am I. We start with a positive core. There's always something really well done in an organization, something that's working. Doesn't mean that there aren't things that you want to do better at, but at the kind of heart of your organization, there's something that's there that's life-giving. You want to focus on that, but you want to engage the people in the inquiry into what you're trying to create. So whatever you do, that's where you start. From there, there's programs, there's lots of research and data that can tell you where you might want to go. Some people are moving quickly to anti-racist training, anti-racism training. That's fantastic. But to start there without kind of knowing where you're trying to go, it could trip you up, just like unconscious bias training can and has a lot of people. So if you're going to do anti-racist training, make it about creating light, not heat. Because a lot of times we've been responding to the racial unrest with heat. And at some point, both the practitioner and the participants will get burned out from heat. But if you're casting light is life-giving. Light will move you forward. Light will allow you to see what the path coming next is. Light will get you to know what the organization wants to create. And that's, to me, most important.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And, how do you in your practice scale that up or down depending on an organization's size? I imagine it looks a little different for smaller organizations versus large global companies.
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit about the scale is really kind of related to resources, right? So even though you might do similar things to a big firm at a smaller scale, but the same things are there. You want to understand what your reason for being is. You want to begin to build awareness. You want to be engaging with people along the way. And if you're moving and you're trying to grow your organization, that becomes your foundation. I actually love smaller firms because you can start building this in early. You don't have to wait until you are at 150, 300, 500, thousands of people. If you do this early, it's built into your foundation. And then you keep doing checks to look at your organizational systems to make sure that you're building them with equity and not, for lack of a better word, colonizing them. So you want to build openness, you want to build kind of input so that people are not surprised when a system gives you a certain feedback. You understand it, and if it needs to be shifted, you can shift it. That's why I think it's, any size organization, if you start with the data, you have an understanding of what's going on in the systems that you have already created. That's step one. Begin the conversation that need a little extra light. You can shine it on them and begin to address them programmatically with sustainability in mind.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, we've got a bunch of questions coming in now. One is asking about specific experience with different diversity initiatives. One asks about anything you've done to develop talent, STEM pipelining, or initiatives to increase supplier diversity spend. So I think if you've had particular insights into those with your clients, if you have anything
STEM
to
talent,
offer.
Yeah, the STEM talent is, look, there's so many students that need exposure to really high level science, and the programs that we did with our post-bac program, we put a lot of resources into that. That was not cheap, but you depending on your size, you can do it whatever scale you want. It's internships, it's apprenticeships, it's a post-bac program. Sometimes you can partner with local governments to fund part of that. There's lots of ways to do it. Sometimes you can partner with other organizations. I think companies that are smaller benefit from potentially collaborating, even bringing in post-bacs and having them in your labs and doing some science that's adjacent to projects you're already doing. So it's really exposure. And what I found is these students are really sharp, but they're underexposed. So you want to give them exposure. And if you can create programs that give them exposure and you have the budget to do it, it actually benefits you both scientifically and sociologically. The other thing is there might be programs where your people can go out and become mentors at an institution. If you don't have the resources to bring them in, they might just come and see your labs or, see some of your experiments or see some of your data analysis, whatever kind of science and technology you do, bringing them in to get exposure to it. They might not be in as a paid intern or employee, but they can come in and learn, or you can go out to them and build those relationships with these schools, either at the college level or even high school or middle school. To me, if you can get in middle schools and start getting kids excited about science and how they apply it, that just sparks a whole bunch of greatness that can blossom in a lot of different directions. So I highly encourage that. But it's situational. I can say how that could happen, but I'm not 100% sure. When it comes to supplier diversity, I think companies should do more about trying to do small investments into new technologies. So it's not just about suppliers and supply chain. It's also about almost like making investments as angel investors in some of these firms, because it's hard for a lot of underrepresented groups who are minorities to get funding. And so even, a $25,000, $50,000 investment can go a long way. And the returns and the relationships and the networks you can build from them and the potential other talent that might come as a result of the relationships you build with them, I think are unprecedented. And, if it's a science that you're trying to kind of adjacently work towards, it could be beneficial to you both in terms of the learning and knowledge that's gained from your investment, as well as, potentially if they have a exit event in the future to pay back that investment.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Really tangible things people can go think about. I appreciate that. We're coming up on the end here, but I do just want to read off the last question because I think it's one that a lot of people have. The attendee asked, do you acknowledge that awareness of bias is not sufficient to reduce bias? What are other ideas or actions you can take in organizations to reduce bias?
I mean, a lot of a reduction of bias is exposure. I mean, some people have never really been exposed to people that are different than them. You know, when I was at Novartis, I had this term called the Mass Ave bias. It meant that everybody came from labs or from institutions that were on Massachusetts Avenue, and even the and that was basically the Mass General Hospital, Harvard, and MIT. And so those are the kind of exposures you've had. But if you don't increase exposure to those, the so-called other, and have an openness to that, that's to me one of the biggest things. There's some stuff scientifically that says that you can reprogram some of your implicit associations with new experiences. And there's a lot of data around that. It'll be hard for me to go through it right now, but it's possible. And it requires that, you put in the time. So you can do that. And then the last thing is you need to build your systems to mitigate bias. And that's around inclusive design. And that's what Inclusion Wins does. Is there certain things that are in your systems that are basically encouraging bias in your talent systems and your decision making, et cetera? And so you need to have a behavioral strategy that also looks at systems and structures to mitigate the adverse impact of those things. And that just takes some a little bit of behavioral science, a little bit of willingness, and a lot of constant work and experimentation and awareness.
Sounds like a good recipe that we can all use.
Yeah.
Amri, thank you so much. This has been incredibly valuable. Thank you everyone on the phone for joining us. We'll be in touch shortly with the slides. You'll also receive a survey once you leave the webinar. Please do take a moment to fill that out and give us feedback on how we can bring you the most value with these sessions. Thank you again. Hope you enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.